3, Forgotten Book of the Wades. The Wades and the Shipyards, pages 56. The banks of the River Tyne were always going to be a gold mine for Wades seeking employment, as my research has shown clearly that most of my father's side of the family, spanning at the very least 230 years, were working at the docks or involved at some point or other with docks and shipyards. This realisation leads me to believe that the sea and the shipbuilding element were naturally ingrained into the Wade genetic. I will start from as far back as I have discovered regarding Wades and docks, from antique reporting and logs found from documentation showing my related Wade family from the far-off distant past being directly involved with shipyards and docks, mainly along the banks of the River Tyne. My report starts in the later 17th century with William Wade, born in 1783, whom was listed as dwelling in Holborn near Commercial Road area near the banks of the River Tyne, listed as maritime and a carpenter. William's sons also, William, Robert, John and George Wade, were merchant navy status. They were moving directly through the Victorian era, listed as carpenters and shipwrights being accustomed to the docks. This points towards repairing ships at the docks. One of William's brothers also was listed as maritime, living close by, Thomas Wade, born 1787, and one of his sons also, a young Thomas Wade, was listed as a sailor AP. And the question begs, who else from their Wade families were dock workers this far back? During the 1880s, documents showing George Wade, born 1823, old Geordie Wade, his sons were also accustomed to the docks and shipyards. John Wade, my direct ancestor, 1861, was listed as a carpenter, shipwright in the Navy, and a ship's fireman, a furnace worker. His twin brother, George Wade, born 1861, was listed as a ship's carpenter the same, and a plumber, and later as a labourer at the docks. William Wade, 1852, was a shipwright in the Navy also, and Thomas Wade, 1869, a ship's fireman. It seems tradition with Wades and the docks. Documents showing John Wade, 1861, his offspring were also dock workers. John George Wade, born 1882, was listed as a ship's fireman like his father. Alfred Bullock Wade, aged 17, was listed as a labourer at the docks as early as 1913, before joining the army for military service. His younger brother, William Alexander Wade, the famous footballer, born 1901, was also accustomed to the dockyards, whom was listed as a ship's fireman like his eldest brother. William also represented Smith Docks and Jarrow football team. It seems from a more modern historic position, my related Wade family were shipwrights, carpenters and ship's firemen, furnace workers. Moving forward towards the 1930s, and my own great-grandfather, Thomas Smith Wade, was listed as working as a plater's helper at the docks. My own grandfather, Thomas James Burrell Wade, was also listed as a plater's helper like his father. John Patty Elliott, Wade in brackets, was accustomed to the docks also, as he was listed as a tank cleaner, which was very hard work. James Burrell Wade was accustomed to the docks as he became a very successful sailor, and as time moves forward, Thomas James Burrell Wade's children were dock workers also. Derek Wade, my uncle Derek, worked as a riveter among other duties at the docks. Kenneth Wade Bull, my uncle, had also worked at the docks. My father, Alan Wade, served his time on the docks as a welder, working on many oil platforms and shipyards throughout his life, mainly in Europe. John Elliott Wade, Bubbo, was a shipwright. Norman Wade, Colin Wade, etc., etc. The list goes on regarding the elders and docks. There's too many to mention. Norman Wade was a foreman. And as time moves forward towards the 1980s, looking at the current elders who grew up, their children also did time on the docks in various positions. Young Kenneth Wade, Uncle Bull's son, was a former sandblaster, then became a very skilled engineer from the docks. His brother, Darren Wade Dapper, laboured on the docks at some point. Mark Wade worked for the Port of Tyne in his younger days, as like his brother Keith Wade, whom also did a stint at the docks, John Elliott Wade's kids. I was told Derek Wade's son, Decker Wade, also worked for periods of times on the docks. Including myself, I also did 2 stints at the docks, working for AMEC on the north of the River Tyne as a welder's mate during the 2000s, and even the sons of some of the current Wade family are still working at the docks. Some of the skills our families gained on the docks involved the following: welding, plating, pipe fitting, engineering, ship repairs and ship building, warehouse work, forklift drivers, crane drivers, carpenters, sailors and donkeymen. It's no surprise with the dockyards being a close source of regular employment spanning over 200 years until the government slowly started closing the yards down in modern history. In the early 1980s, it became harder and harder to stay in employment at the docks. Yet still, even today, the Wades find work on the docks. As like most dock workers, the Wades were no strangers to a drop of social in pubs and clubs and bars. On many photos I have seen showing my Wade family, we have always looked happiest sitting at the bar, drinking beer and enjoying the socialising, especially during the 60s, 70s and well into the 1980s. Wades were always out socialising and drinking beers, smartly dressed, enjoying their evening with family and friends. Page 57, Part 3, Thomas Smith Wade's family. In this next section, I am going to list as many Wades available connected to me from the 18th century. From here, I will disclose who is actually related to whom and backtrack my relatives towards the 17th century and find names of Wades within the census documents showing links to me. As follows, the names of Wades connected to me here in 2016 from the 18th century and early 1900s. These people were alive and kicking over 100 years before I was even born. John Wade, head and father, 1861 to 1943, listed family, grandfather Wade times 2. Jane Ann Wade, 1865 to 1932, formerly Bullock, wife and mother. John George Wade, 1882 to 1956. Thomas Smith Wade, 1886 to 1963, my great-grandfather Wade. Dina Ann Wade, 1889 to 1908, Catherine Jane Wade, 1891, Alfred Bullock Wade, 1894 to 1918, Alice Wade, 1897 or 1898 estimated, William Alexander Wade, Bill Wade, 1901 to 1958, famous footballer, May Ellen Wade, 1905. Next family, George Wade, head and father, born on the 9th of the 10th, 1823, died in 1893, grandfather Wade times 3. Wife, Catherine Isabella Ellison Wade, and mother, 1825 to 1890. Elizabeth Wade, daughter, 1844. John Ellison Wade, son, 1846, 6th of December, St Hilda, South Shields, died 1846, 9th of December. Catherine Wade, 1848, daughter. William Wade the son, born 9th of May 1852, St Hilda. John Wade the son, 1861 to 1943, grandfather Wade times 2, Stoke to Merrill, Devon, England. George Wade the son, 1861 to 1929, Stoke to Merrill, Devon, England. Thomas Wade son, 1867 or 69, estimated, Durham, South Shields. With Thomas Smith Wade being my direct Wade lineage, as he was the grandfather of my father, Alan Wade, this would indicate that all of my father's brothers and sisters and all of his cousins across his Wade side are all sharing the same history lesson here as myself, including all of their children also. This means that all of Elizabeth Burrell Wade's offspring, all of Thomas James Burrell Wade's offspring, my grandfather, all of James Burrell Wade's offspring and all of John Paddy Elliott Wade and Brackett's offspring are following the same history as the actual history I have mapped out here. This means as I travel backwards in my education here, I am actually taking you with me, my brothers and their children, my Wade cousins, first, second and third, etc. and their children also. As Alan Wade's youngest son, I have plenty of Wade cousins across his family, so this is their dynamic history as well as mine. Enjoy it, Amma. From our perspective, we are the offshoot of old Thomas Smith Wade. From this point onwards, I am heading back in time like being transported on a time machine. So enjoy the history lesson here. You will be travelling through centuries of my lost Wade heritage. As this information becomes revealed to you, the forgotten knowledge will slowly develop inside your mind. As you lock this information inside, the family knowledge will come back as it did for me. My great-grandfather, Thomas Smith Wade, was the second eldest son of John Wade listed in the upper family group. As I see, he has brothers and sisters, and below this, in the second family group, I notice George Wade, or Geordie Wade, which was the grandfather of Thomas Smith Wade. And if I look at his family also, I can start developing a picture of my lost Wade heritage. I will start from John Wade, 1861, and work through their families, heading backwards in time, disclosing who they were, and hopefully I can form a mental image of my forgotten families. I will backlink skills any of these people may have shared with more modern Wades in history or current Wades to see how past genetics and skill passing from one generation to the next may work. As the reader moves through the pages, I will show clearly the movement of my Wade ancestors with census reports showing street locations, family members and the times they lived there, with evidence pulled directly from library reports. I have managed to plot a small mental voyage for the reader to view this. From John Wade, I will show his occupation, his address, his marriage to Jane Ann Bullock, and how they moved through time, shifting location from one address to the other. From here, I can build a mental view individually of each Wade family member in my forgotten antique family and investigate them to see clearly who I was related to back in time. From here, I show how George Wade, old Geordie Wade, was my next direct Wade ancestor, and again show the links and the movement and any occupation these Victorian Wades may have had. Pages 58. Thomas Smith Wade's father, John Wade, 1861 to 1943. As far as the evidence has led me, John Wade, Thomas Smith Wade's father, was born in 1861 in the registered district of Devonshire, Stoke to Merrill. Upon documents, his brother, George Wade, was born in 1861 also in the same district. In both cases, I could find no birth certificates for South Shields. George and Catherine Wade, John and George's parents, were making frequent visits to that part of England during the time of their births. The street in Devonport was listed as Cornwall Street. In later pages of the book, I will describe how this occurred. Through evidence, I know that John Wade grew up in South Shields as he was listed upon census documents at the addresses my ancestors dwelled at. By the 1870s, he was listed as dwelling on Albion Street, South Shields. By 1881, his parents moved to the Garden Lane area. And by 1883, he was listed as living at 26 Brunswick Street, Leggett, South Shields. John married Jane Ann Bullock in 1883, also Thomas Smith Wade's mother, and they dwelled on the corner of Princess Street and Orange Street during this time frame. By 1901, his wife and children were dwelling at 16 Bedford Street, Leggett, South Shields. By 1914, his wife and children were living on Corbridge Street, Leggett, South Shields. By 1939, John Wade, in his retirement, was dwelling on St Cuthbert Street, The Hill, in South Shields, dwelling with the Mullen family, listed as a retired seagoing fireman. The photo on the right side may in fact be John Wade, as this gentleman was seen clearly on a rare photo of John George Wade, John Wade's son, or Thomas Smith Wade's older brother, passed to me from family in Hartlepool. I show this in later pages of the book and explain it acute. Regarding John Wade's trade, throughout his life he was listed as a shipwright, a carpenter, a ship's fireman, a donkeyman and ultimately merchant navy. This strengthened my evidence tracking, as his own father, the late old Geordie Wade, was listed as a ship's carpenter in the merchant navy the same. Even John's grandfather, the late William Wade, was also listed as a carpenter in the maritime. Overwhelmingly, the conclusion is that from generation to generation, the ship's carpentry trade kept showing up. This made me settle on the fact that I had indeed found my Wade ancestors passing these vital skill sets from generation to generation. According to maritime reports I had found in the National Archives, between at least 1890 towards 1920, at a rough estimate, John Wade, on and off, was listed as travelling on steamships as the ship's fireman, as I will show in the coming reports. From ship to ship and log to log, I found the documents showing my great-grandfather's father listed as sailing on steamboats, working hard with his shovel below deck in the boiler rooms, travelling across ports across the world as a sailor. By 1902, John and Jane Wade's marriage went through a very troubling time, as I will show the report in coming pages. John Wade was always working away from home, travelling on steamboats. Meanwhile, his wife, Jane Ann Wade, was bringing children up for longer periods of time alone, as she had 8 children, with one of them being my great-grandfather, Thomas Smith Wade. This evidence corresponds perfectly with John Wade's address matrix for 1902 onwards, as he was not listed as dwelling with his wife and children on Bedford Street. Instead, he was dwelling at 12 George Street, Leggett, South Shields, near his brother's residence, George Wade, as his marriage was breaking down. Although no evidence was detected so far showing they had divorced. On the following page, I will show some evidence regarding my great-grandfather's father, John Wade's sea excursions pulled directly from National Archives. Page 59, Forgotten Book of the Wade. Thomas Smith Wade's father, John Wade, 1861 to 1943, continued. The above top snippet showing John Wade's name and occupation was pulled directly from the 1939 register for South Shields, showing evidence he was listed as the ship's fireman. The two above images of the steamboats named the Karanja and the Millpool were actual vessels that John Wade carried out his ship's fireman's duties on. The first golden piece of evidence I have detected regarding John Wade travelling on board the steamships as the fireman is shown clearly in the report below, as follows. Ship, Boston City, official number 84538, date 1891, held by the National Archives. Legal status, public record, reference BT 99170343. John Wade, rank rating fireman, age 30, place of birth South Shields, previous ship South Tyne. As I see, the log year is 1891, John is age 30, going back 30 years, the year would have been 1861. Exactly the same year my great-grandfather's father was born, in 1861. So, by 1891, John Wade was travelling on a ship named Boston City, working down below of the deck, fueling the ship's furnace with other workers. Back in South Shields during this time matrix, John had been married to Jane Ann Bullock 8 years. His eldest son was 9 years old, John George Wade. His second son was aged 5 years old, Thomas Smith Wade, and Catherine Jane Wade Catty was recently born. The address was on the corner of Princess Street and Orange Street. So, when John returned home from working away, his family were dwelling here. As I imagine this, John Wade shovelling coal on the travelling steamboats, then returning home after months at a time from being away from his family. It must have been a very difficult situation for all of my Wade ancestors, missing their father, and the children missing him, and Jane bringing them up for longer periods of time. This would have been occurring during the 1890s, approximately 120 years gone. Crew list, agreement and official logs for ship Romsdalen, official number 102729, vessels Romsdalen, John Wade, rate and ranking, fireman and trimmer, age 51, place of birth South Shields, previous ship Cronji, ship Karanja, image above, number 125620, John Wade, rank rating fireman, age 51, place of birth South Shields, previous ship the Millpool vessel. Crew listing agreements and official logs for ship Millpool, official number 124317, vessels Millpool, image above, John Wade, rank rating fireman and trimmer, age 52, place of birth South Shields, previous ship the same. Ship Kirkby, official number 98517, John Wade, rank rating fireman and trimmer, age 53, place of birth South Shields, previous ship the same ship of West Hartlepool. Listed above were some of the reports I had pulled directly from the archives. In all, I had found about 10 logs showing John Wade being moved from ship to ship working as the ship's fireman. Many sailors were listed alongside John Wade's logs. I had only listed John's log. As cited from above, John Wade worked on the Karanja and the Millpool steam vessels whose images I had found, as shown above. It is of interest to note that John's age matrix is 51 in two of the reports, then age 52, then age 53. Calculating this based upon the evidence so far cited, it would mean John was still working aboard these steamboats from at least the age of 30 towards 53, based upon National Archives data, 23 years to be precise. Looking at the Kirkby log, when John is age 53, calculating it based upon when John was born in 1861, adding 51 years, would place the year log at 1914. So, from at least 1890 towards 1914, my great-grandfather's father, John Wade, was travelling across the world upon these steam vessels, grafting hard with his shovel, fueling the burning furnaces below the ship's deck. If John Wade was listed as a seagoing fireman by 1939, retired, as the documents showed, then this could mean this was his last known trade. Page 60. A ship's fireman while traversing the ocean, John Wade, 1861-1943. My great-grandfather's father, John Wade, was listed in many reports as the ship's fireman sailing on many various steamboats as listed from the previous page. The reports and evidence have shown me clearly that this was the case. Trying to visualize this correctly and learn what this entailed, I had found out the following information regarding the firemen on board steamships. The given steamship is travelling along its course from one destination to the other across the oceans through all kinds of rough seas and horrendous weather. Below deck, the deck engineer, the junior engineer, the wiper, the machinist, the oiler, the fireman, the water tender, to name but a few, are all sync-lined in tending to the cogs of the busy machinery of the given vessel. Teamwork is paramount in such a hard-working situation, as I imagine Thomas's father, John Wade, grafting with his shovel, sailing the seas, earning his keep. The ship's firemen would take turns as in shifts. The shift was called fire room watch. The next fireman to come on duty would be signalled by the oiler 10 minutes previous to the fireman coming on duty. Near this time, the ship's fireman enters the fire room and begins his inspection of the plant. The fireman will firstly check his boiler gauge to ensure that the water in his boiler is at the proper level. In the event that the fireman is acting responsible for tending to the water in the boiler, he will blow the glasses down and ascertain the accuracy of the water level. The fireman would generally work under orders of the water tender if he is on watch. If not, he would check this himself. The fireman checks his fires and the burners to make sure everything is running smooth in his workspace. His tile cone is checked. He checks for oil leaks and surrounding connections of the oil lines and burners. He scouts for leakages with an eagle's eye along the floor plates for oil drippings which could cause fires. Cleanliness from oil drippings and spillages are at the forefront of the fireman's attention. He takes notes of pressure gauge readings at various points in the oil line. He next checks temperatures to make sure everything is being maintained satisfactory to his standards. After everything is checked, which would affect the fire room watch shift, the fireman would then ask the fireman who was leaving shift, was everything alright during the watch, any problems, and any specific orders from the engineer. If everything as it should be, the fireman coming on duty would then take all responsibility for his next shift. After taking over the watch, the fireman now needs to maintain full control of his plant during his shift. He is checking everything constantly, making sure all levels and gauges are operational. He will change suction and discharge strainers, thus cleaning the previous ones which were in use during the last shift. He would replace them in the body of the strainer. Next, the fireman will change his burners. These are being changed alternately from boiler to boiler and never more than one in a boiler at a time. While the burner is being changed, it is out of operation for a few minutes it takes. During this changeover, there is the same amount of water entering the boiler as before, but less steam will be made. The water accumulates in excess amounts, thus raising levels in the boiler. The fireman is constantly checking and watching as he conducts his busy work, which entails physical and mental strain as his steamboat traverses the seas. After the strainers and burners have been changed and everything is going smoothly, the fireman would then make inspections at definite intervals. Anything can go wrong at any moment if his machinery and gauges are not checked accordingly. At this point, I am sure the fireman would relax a little and smoke, or play cards with other workers. I am sure they would have had small perks throughout their voyages. As I picture this from my mind's eye, John Wade, below the deck on the steam vessels conducting his duties across the world, as the maritime logs were written clearly as evidence for me to digest. Amazing Wade history, I pondered. Page 61. John Wade and Jane Ann Bullock's marriage certificate. On the 14th of May 1883, John Wade married Jane Ann Bullock at St. Stephen's Church in South Shields. 130 plus years ago, these people were marrying and living life to the fullest way before I was even thought of, and yet their blood, their genetics belong to me right here in 2016. I'm 100% convinced with evidence of this. I walk past this church regularly here in 2016 and never even knew it. Talk about ignorance. It's hard to imagine it actually, in 1883, in that moment, on the 14th of May, my great-grandfather's parents married before he was even born. Thinking about my genealogy chart and seeing in the report that George Wade attended this, John's father, and John Bullock, Jane's father, I would imagine some of old Geordie Wade's brothers and sisters attending, John's uncles and aunts from Wade's side, and John's brothers and sisters. I wonder what they were like. After researching dresswear during the 1880s, it suggested that the women wore long silk dresses, calico bustle gowns, jack-eyed basques, silk taffeta bodice, designer hats. The men wore Victorian suits, shirt collar and silk neckwear, watch chain, one ring, shirt stud and sleeve buttons were normal jewellery allowable for the gentlemen. I tried to imagine my ancestors. I'd bet they were down to earth with plenty of jokes, knowing Wades, horses and carts picking them up from their homes, plenty of food and drinks. I bet they were living it up given its time frame, Hammer. After researching my antique relatives, my visualization of them is hard-working people and doing well, enjoying mid-18th century existence without the needed technology we so hesitantly require here in 2016. I picture them discussing ships, building, sailing, hard-working people down on the docks, Hammer, and imagine them loving that environment, naturally adapting to working life and naturally loving a drop of social and family gatherings. They were definitely hard-working and doing well for themselves, given the time frame and given the society back then, 1883 in South Shields. During 1883, out of interest to the Wade history, John and Jane, whilst being married, had one child already born, John George Wade, born 1882. I assume he was named after his father John and middle named after his grandfather George. John's father, George Wade, would have been aged 60, and his mother, Catherine Wade, aged 58. I know John's brother, George Wade, was aged 22 at this point, and his to-be spouse was named Isabella. The area in which they lived was near Leggett Lane, South Shields. So, the distance from their homes in St. Stephen's Church, South Shields, is just around the corner. Looking at this from my mind's eye, I can visualise them back in time, either walking it towards St. Stephen's Church from Leggett or riding a horse and cart. Victorian-related Wade's, Hammer. Out of interest, from my perspective, looking back in time at my direct Wade lineage, this event occurred 3 years before my great-grandfather Thomas Smith Wade was even thought of, and 30 years before my granddad, Thomas James Burrell Wade, was thought of. And to be really complex about it, 64 years before my father, Alan Wade, was even born. Upon the following page, I will pinpoint and disclose more startling information for this wedding certificate and the surrounding location based upon maps of South Shields in the given time frame for 1883. Page 62. John Wade, Jane Ann Bullock marriage, 14th of May 1883, continued. Firstly, I see the date as suspected, 14th of May 1883. I already know this and already knew they married at St. Stephen's Church, South Shields. Next, I notice ages. John is aged 22, Jane is aged 18. John was 4 years older than his to-be spouse. I notice John Wade is listed as a carpenter, which makes complete sense as George Wade, his father, was a carpenter the same. The Wades were carpenters this far back in time in South Shields in the 1880s. I notice actual addresses which sheds light onto the book itself. As on census, it stated in 1880s, John Wade was listed as dwelling on Garden Lane area with his parents. Invariably, the actual address, which was 26 Brunswick Street, Leggett, South Shields. Jane Ann Bullock's address in 1883 was 4 streets up from John's home on 32 Raglan Street. I also noticed John's father's name in far right, George Wade, and Jane's father, John Bullock. Outside of view on the image, it states that the actual witness to the wedding was named William Watson. In the below images, I will show where my Wade ancestors actually dwelled in 1883. In 1883, during the month of May, my related Wade ancestors were in the Leggett area and St. Stephen's Church. The above map snippets are taken directly from a map of South Shields in 1883, which was a spot of luck for me here in 2016, trying to locate my Wade ancestry. On the right image, Brunswick Street in 1883 was located just at the top of Leggett Lane in South Shields, near Frederick Street today. I have highlighted this. If I look 5 streets above this, I notice Raglan Street running off to the top right. Another point of interest is the fact that by 1890, Thomas Smith Wade was listed as a 4-year-old child on the corner of Orange Street and Princess Street. Before this, I could imagine his address nearer his birth to be at his mother's address on 32 Raglan Street. So, I now know my Wade ancestors in 1883 were dwelling on Elliott at 26 Brunswick Street before John Wade even married Jane Ann Bullock. On the left image, I notice St. Stephen's Church in 1883. I have highlighted this on the centre of the map. The church still stands today, which is located at the top of Mile End Road connecting from Fowler Street and just off of King Street, town centre. This is where my Wade ancestors stood on the 14th of May 1883 in the presence of George Wade, Old Geordie Wade and John Bullock and William Watson, the witness. The only related Wade child whom would have been present at this wedding would have been my great-grandfather's older brother, John George Wade, aged 1. Also of ultimate interest is the word spinster written next to Jane Ann Bullock's name, either representing a single woman or a person whom spun wool on the cheap. Pages 63. My great-grandfather, Thomas Smith Wade, aged 4, family report in 1891. Above, an actual image of Princess Street and Orange Street in South Shields during the 1930s. I know according to research my Wade ancestors lived on either Princess Street or Orange Street in 1891, as reports fluctuate from one or the other. This realisation leads me to believe they dwelled on the corner of both streets or very near it. On the right side is a report of John Wade's family. Below is an actual image showing the report of my Wade ancestors and evidence they were living on Orange Street. My great-grandfather was aged 4. He was my grandfather's father going back 3 generations. An actual census report from library reports showing my Wade ancestors' families' names. I first notice on left side and Orange Street. On the right side I notice John Wade, aged 30, Jane A. Wade, aged 26, John G. Wade, aged 7, Thomas Wade, my great-grandfather, aged 4, Dina Ann Wade, aged 1, and Jane A. Bullock, the cousin, aged 13. A note of interest is the fact that John Wade is aged 30 inside the report. I already know John Wade was born in 1861. Calculating this 30 years forward from 1861, I end up at 1891. So, this report must have been logged in 1891. Jane Ann Bullock, when she was aged 5, according to a library report, was living with her parents on Orange Street. From Jane Ann Bullock Wade's perspective, being aged 26 in this report, it must have felt like going home, back to the neighbourhood where she grew up in, because 21 years previous to dwelling here in 1891, she was actually growing up here on this very street in the 1870s. Another new realisation is noticing Jane Ann Bullock, aged 13. This Jane Ann Bullock was the cousin of my great-grandfather, Thomas, and his brothers and sisters. She was obviously a niece to Jane Ann Wade. So, I now know Jane must have had a brother or sister on her Bullock side of the family with children living close by. Another point of interest is the fact that the cousin, Jane, seems to be named after her aunt, Jane Ann Wade, Jane Ann Bullock. This would indicate closeness among family clearly. As previously shown, John Wade was working away from home as a ship's fireman in 1891, working on the Boston City ship. This would indicate he dwelled at this location when he was home from being away on ships shoveling coal. This would mean his wife, Jane, and the children hardly ever seen him much during 1891. Page 64. Thomas Smith Wade, aged 14, family report in 1901. An actual document listed from library records showing the household of my Wade ancestors in 1901. Interestingly enough, I first noticed John Wade the father is not listed at the household. As suspected, he either worked away for longer periods of time shoveling coal on ships or he had moved out of the house. I noticed my great-grandfather's older brother listed as a 17-year-old working as a hewer, a mine worker. This is very important evidence, first of all, because in his section of the book it states clearly on an application form John George Wade files, he states clearly at the bottom of the form his last employer, or master as they termed it. He was working at the coal depot, Templetown, South Shields. I notice other golden evidence. It states clearly that my great-grandfather, Thomas Smith Wade, is a mineral worker aged 14. In those long gone days, teenagers worked down the pits as mine workers, so it's no surprise my recent antique ancestors worked down these coal mines, including my great-grandfather, Thomas Smith Wade, aged 14, and his older brother, John George Wade, aged 17. As stated, John gained his hewer recognition from working at the mines. A hewer was an experienced coal mine worker who would chip away at the minerals from rocks, also known as a miner who had passed their test. Another interesting fact is that Dina Ann Wade, while she was aged 11, was listed as a domestic servant, carrying out her duties on Peel Street in Leggett. She worked for a family with the surname Little. So, as the picture is developing from page to page, I can safely say John Wade the father was a ship's fireman working away from home, sailing on ships, age 40. John George Wade and my great-grandfather were both working down pits. Dina Ann Wade at school, but also listed as a domestic duties. Catherine Jane Wade at school. Alfred Bullock Wade was age 6. Alice Wade was a baby. And William Alexander Wade, the famous footballer, was recently born. The area in which my Wade family was located in South Shields during 1901 was 16 Bedford Street, as I will show in the following page. This area was directly in the Leggett area near what is now known as the Frederick Street area. Bedford Street Avenue is located just off of Leggett Lane heading towards Chichester Metro Station today. It is remarkable to wonder that over 116 years past, my genetics were dwelling and surviving in the same town I grew up in, and seemingly the same part of town. Also of significance during this time frame in history is the fact that John Wade's twin brother, George Wade, 1861, Thomas Smith Wade's uncle, lived nearby in the Leggett area also. His youngest brother, Thomas Wade, 1869, who lived nearby also. Most of John Wade's family were around these areas in this given time frame in history. This means my direct Wade ancestors had cousins and uncles and aunts nearby. As the book develops, the reader will discover who they were back in time, as John Wade, Thomas's father, did have brothers and sisters in the South Shields area. Page 65. Thomas Smith Wade, aged 14-15, family report in 1901. An extremely rare photo found online of a picture of Bedford Street in Leggett, South Shields during the 1900s. The street has well been pulled down and there was hardly any record of it at all listed for South Shields. I know, according to hardcore research, my Wade relatives lived at number 16 Bedford Street as late as 1901, as it was stated clearly on William Alexander Wade's birth certificate I had acquired from the South Shields Registry Office during 2014. Bedford Street was located just off of Leggett Lane. Today it is named Bedford Avenue and new houses stand. By the 22nd of March 1901, when William was born, it stated clearly my Wade ancestors were living on 16 Bedford Street, South Shields, on the upper right snippet of William Alexander Wade's birth certificate. Listed also on the certificate on the right hand side, hidden from view, is his parents' names, John Wade and Jane Wade, formerly Bullock. It states, as suspected, John Wade was a journeyman, a shipwright, but I already knew this, because according to deeper research, he was a ship's fireman working away from home for longer periods of time, which I have already scrutinised from maritime records. I will also show William Alexander Wade's birth certificate fully in his section of the book in coming pages. As the history is finally being unlocked from my Wade ancestors according to my research, I can safely start to form a mental picture of their movement up until the point my own great-grandfather moved into his own home on 162 Palmerston Street, South Shields. As it seems, my historic Wade family were firstly listed at 26 Brunswick Street in 1883, South Shields. They then moved to the corner of Princess and Orange Street by 1891, and then from here towards 1901 they moved to 16 Bedford Street, then onto 41 Corbridge Street, which I will show in the next page. It is interesting to note, based upon the research and ages of my antique relations in 1901, while they were dwelling here in Leggett, South Shields on Bedford Street, the eldest son, John George Wade, would have been 18 years old. My great-grandfather, Thomas Smith Wade, 14 to 15 years old. Dina Ann Wade, 12 years old. Catherine Jane Wade, 10-year-old. Alfred Bullock Wade, 7 years old. Alice Wade, 4 years old. And the famous footballer, William Alexander Wade, was born in 1901. And at this point, May Jane Wade was not even born yet for another 4 years, because she was born in 1905, which I will show also on the next page. 115 plus years ago, my antique Wade family were based directly in the middle of Leggett. Remarkable. Again, the picture is becoming clearer. If John George Wade was a hewer at aged 18, working down pits as a coal miner, alongside my great-grandfather, whom was also listed as a miner working down pits, aged 14, Then the pair of them must have been getting up each morning as teenagers together, leaving for work from Elliott, South Shields on 16 Bedford Street, and may have been working down the same pit in 1901 at the coal depot, Templetown, South Shields. It seems plausible as all of the evidence tallies up to perfection. It may have well been a different pit. Nevertheless, the evidence has shown me clearly that both John and Thomas, as the two elder brothers in my historic Wade family, were both working as miners around about this time frame in history during 1901. Their father, John Wade, was working away on ships, shoveling coal in the boiler rooms as a furnace worker. Page 66, Thomas Smith Wade, age 15-16, family report in 1902. By 1902, John Wade would have been age 41. I notice a troubling article cited from the South Shields Gazette archives showing family quarrels among my Wade ancestors. Dated from the Shields Daily Gazette Shipping Telegraph, Friday, June the 20th, 1902, Jane Ann Wade had summoned her husband John Wade at court over an issue. John Wade is listed as residing at number 12 George Street, South Shields. This would either mean John Wade was staying at a temporary address while this dispute was going on, or he had actually moved out of 16 Bedford Street, Elliott, South Shields, his wife and children's address. In one of the articles it claims 16 Redford Street. This may have been a spelling error, as the evidence produced showed 16 Bedford Street from registry documentation. In the article, Jane had told the court that during the Friday night last, which would have been June the 10th, 1902, that John had come home and a fight broke out. On the following day, on the Saturday, John came home again and another fight broke out. During those past 5 weeks, this domestic issue had been going on. This would indicate from at least April the 20th, extending John and Jane Wade, Thomas Smith Wade's parents, were having marriage problems. My great-grandfather, Thomas Smith Wade, would have been aged 16 years old while his parents were fighting one another. So, as a teen, my great-grandfather, Thomas, witnessed his parents quarrelling and fighting in Elliott, South Shields. In the report, it is stated that both John and Jane Wade had been married for at least 19 years, and that they had 7 children together by 1902. This evidence ties in with my previous reporting perfectly, as in 1883, John married Jane. Counting forwards towards 1902, I land at 19 years. This evidence gained from the South Shields Gazette archives is definitely my Wade ancestors then. This would also point towards the fact that John and Jane Wade by 1902 were definitely having marriage problems and may have divorced at some moment or other. May Wade was born in 1905 and she was the 8th child born, the youngest, as at this point in 1902 she was not even born yet. This could explain that John and Jane Wade remained together for at least another 3 years after these troubling times, as this above log was written in June 1902. Either this or they divorced and gave it another go. Jane told the court that for the past 4 or 5 years they had been quarrelling. By Monday, July the 28th in 1902, Jane had again summoned her husband to court. In the report, Jane had applied for judicial separation and made an order for maintenance. In the article, they are both quarrelling about money, debt and drink issues. John Wade was ordered to pay a maintenance sum of 12 shillings a week towards his wife and children. This means from June the 20th to July the 28th, roughly 5 or 6 weeks after the first court case, Jane decided to push harder for separation. Their offspring, as pointed out, was still being born up until 1905. Yet here, in 1902, they were separating. This could indicate that they may have in fact give their marriage another chance at some point or other, as May Wade was born in 1905. This would mean that, as my great-grandfather Thomas Smith Wade was a teenager, his parents were fighting and quarrelling. Thomas would grow up seeing this play out around him, alongside his older brother John George Wade and their younger brother and sisters, Dina, Catherine and Alfred Wade especially. William Wade was a baby when his parents were quarrelling. It is also of interest to point out that John Wade's twin brother, George Wade, dwelled at number 17 George Street. This could point towards John dwelling only 5 doors away from his brother's residence on 12 George Street, while he was having family issues with his wife, Jane Ann Bullock Wade. If Jane had summoned her husband to court, this could have pointed towards John Wade not dwelling at 16 Bedford Street in that instance, as she was summoning him. and the evidence showed that my Wade ancestors were dwelling on 16 Bedford Street in this time frame in Wade-related history, and John's address is 12 George Street. It points towards 12 George Street being a temporary address while he was fighting with his missus. Either John was staying at a close friend's home or a family member's address, as his twin brother only lived 5 doors away from him on 17 George Street by this troubling point in 1902. Thomas Smith Wade, aged 16-17, family report in 1903, pages 67, Forgotten Book of the Wades. By 1903, my Wade ancestors were in the local newspapers again. They were obviously going through a very troubling period, as in this next story, in which I cited directly from the Shields Daily Gazette, will show, dated Tuesday, June the 9th in 1903. In the report, the title reads, Stealing Distrained Goods. A curious South Shields case. The article claims Jane Ann Wade, aged 36, married, was up at court for stealing household goods involving a distraint for rent which had been levied. In the report, a Mr. Henry Farthing stated on April the 1st last in 1903, he distrained the items for rent arrears. During that time, she resided at 25 Raglan Street, Leggett. The rent due amounted to £1, 5 shillings 6d, the items in particular not being enough to pay for the amount due, but he would agree to take what furniture was there if she gave up the possession of the house. He allowed her to remove certain smaller items for herself. After she left the premises, she handed in the key and proceeded to leave the house carrying what she could. Mr. Farthing left the premises locked securely. The next morning, when he went to take the goods as arrears, showing up with a horse and cart at 25 Raglan Street, Leggett, South Shields, he found that everything was gone, all of the furniture and everything else. In subsequence, she was traced to 201 Campbell Street, where she was living under her father's name. The goods being in possession were the same as the goods given up at 25 Raglan Street. After being traced, it was discovered that her son had broken into the house at 25 Raglan Street and carried off the furniture and his mother's given possessions. She pleaded guilty, claiming it was owing to her husband, from where she had a separation order, not paying her any maintenance money. Jane was fined £2, including costs, with an addition of 30 shillings to be paid to Mr. Farthing. For starters, to strengthen the ancestral Wade family evidence, I noticed Jane Ann Wade, aged 36, married, being mentioned in the report. This would indicate that Jane was still married to John by 1903, even though they had a separation order going on, including maintenance payments. On the second account, I noticed 25 Raglan Street. This is new knowledge for me, as just before Jane married John in 1883, her address was 32 Raglan Street, her parents'. This would suggest she either had her own place a couple of doors away from her parents, or she was dwelling at a family member's address temporarily while this separation was going on. This address was definitely in my related Wade family, or possibly in the Bullock side of the family, as her own son emptied the address of furniture and took it to 201 Campbell Street, as the report suggested. On the third account, I noticed 201 Campbell Street. This is golden evidence these people were my ancestors, as John George Wade, her eldest son, resided at that address during 1904, roughly. In the above statement, it mentions 201 Campbell Street. She was living under her father's name. This would suggest that 201 Campbell Street was in fact where her parents had moved to after 32 Raglan Street. Jane's father was named John Bullock. This means when John George Wade moved out of his mother's address, he stayed at his grandfather Bullock's address for a while before moving out. As in one report, it did suggest John George Wade in 1904 was residing at 201 Campbell Street, upon a document I had found, which I will show in John George Wade's section of the book. So, during June in 1903, Jane Ann Wade, my great-grandfather's mother, handed the key in to a Mr. Farthing, as she could not afford to pay her way. She proceeded to 201 Campbell Street, her father's address, with what little she could carry, bless her. As on the following day, Mr. Farthing was going to show up with a horse and cart and empty her home of its belongings in rent arrears. That night, Jane must have informed her sons, either John George Wade or my great-grandfather Thomas Smith Wade, and then they proceeded to 25 Raglan Street, or one of them did, and broke into the premises and retrieved their mother's belongings, including furniture. In 1903, John George Wade was aged 21. My great-grandfather Thomas was aged 16 or 17. As the evidence points towards this direction, I can vaguely sense this from my good old third eye hammer. The Wade brothers retrieving their mother's possessions late at night, forcing access to their previous home in the month of June in 1903 in Leggett. John Wade was not paying any maintenance to his wife Jane, and now she was homeless, dwelling at her father's address. John George Wade, or my great-grandfather Thomas Smith Wade, carrying furniture, chairs, tables, ornaments, whatever they could salvage, before Mr. Farthing showed up the next day across Leggett late at night, heading towards Campbell Street from Raglan Street. John Wade was either on George Street in Leggett also when this occurred, or was away on the ships shoveling coal. Amazing history, I pondered. Page 68, Forgotten Book of the Wades. Thomas Smith Wade, aged 24 to 25, family report in 1911. The photo of Corbridge Street is from the 1960s. Finding an earlier photo of this street was near impossible, as I searched vigorously for this but failed. The street was located in the Leggett area of South Shields, previously known as High Shields. At the bottom of the street is Redhead Dockyards, showing the cranes and shipyard buildings. Taylor Street ran just to the left of the photo. This would also make much sense with John Wade the father working away at sea as the ship's fireman, being located closely to the docks in South Shields. And, as more evidence was revealed, it showed at least Alfred Bullock Wade, his son, my great-grandfather's younger brother, was a labourer at the docks near this time frame during 1910-1911. By 1911, I first noticed John George Wade is not listed living at his parents' home at this point, whom would have been aged 28 in 1911 if I am going by the reports within the given time matrix. My own great-grandfather, Thomas Smith Wade, is neither listed at his parents' home, whom would have been aged 24-25-year-old. John Wade is not listed at the address. Very interesting, I thought. As like in previous reports, he was either working away on ship still or was dwelling at a different location, possibly George Street, as one previous report did show this from the Gazette archives. I noticed J. Wade, Jane Ann Wade, the mother, aged 46, Catherine Wade, Catty, aged 20, Alfred Bullock Wade, aged 17, working at the local docks as a labourer, Alice Wade, aged 13, William Wade, the famous footballer, aged 10, and May Wade, aged 6. In the below image, I will show evidence showing them dwelling at this location as written on reports from the library. This would mean from 1903 to 1911, Jane went from dwelling with her father on Campbell Street, homeless, to finding a new home on Corbridge Street within the Leggett area also. As suspected, the signature name is J. Wade of 41 Corbridge Street, South Shields, Jane Ann Wade. As the book continues, as I unlock each family member individually, it becomes clear Jane Ann Wade remained at this address continuing, as each son and daughter report continuing from 1906, 41 Corbridge Street was written in the report, as you will notice throughout. An interesting note is that during 1910, Elizabeth Burrell Wade was born, whom would have been 1 year old, living with her mother and father, my great-grandparents, at 2 Berwick Street, as I will show on the next page. Thomas went on and moved into 162 Palmerston Street, South Shields, to start his own Wade family after this. John George Wade was listed as living on Campbell Street at first, then he moved to Reed Street, then Leighton Street, South Shields. Bearing in mind this was before he actually moved to Hartlepool, at least 2 years beforehand. On the next page, I will show evidence of my great-grandfather Thomas's location before he moved into 162 Palmerston Street. Page 69, Forgotten Book of the Wade. Thomas Smith Wade, aged 24-25, family report. By the time my great-grandfather reached the age of 24, he had moved out of his parents' home, John Wade and Jane Ann Bullock Wade's. As the report showed, my great-grandfather was living on 16 Bedford Street with his parents. Then, when they moved to 41 Corbridge Street, my great-grandfather was not listed there. Instead, he was living with his spouse's parents at 2 Berwick Street, Leggett, South Shields, before moving into 162 Palmerston Street, Leggett. Listed above, according to library sources, James Burrell was the father and head of the household. James was aged 48, and written clearly across his name were the words widower and the words from foundry. This means my research was correct. His wife, Elizabeth Burrell, had died by the time this report was logged during 1911. James Burrell was also listed as a joiner and a metal dresser in other reports that I had disclosed. Below his name, I noticed my great-grandmother Wade, Isabella Burrell Wade, aged 27, listed as married. A huge note of significance I noticed straight away is that listed in her columns it states she had 2 children, but one of them died. This also points towards my research being correct, as I noticed a James B. Wade was born, then died earlier on throughout my Wade research. The report also suggested she had been married for 3 years to Thomas Smith Wade at this stage, which also tallies up perfect with my research. Other family members included James Burrell, the son, aged 20, from Foundry, Elizabeth Burrell, Lizzie, daughter, aged 15, attending school, Charles Burrell, the son, aged 6, attending school, Thomas Wade, son-in-law, aged 24, listed as married. His occupation is listed, general labourer. The words from Foundry are written near his name. I also notice a number 4 written near the from Foundry. This may indicate he spent 4 years working with metal. Then, by the time this log surfaced, his job had changed. Interesting, I pondered. Elizabeth Burrell Wade, the daughter, was age 1. Also of interest is the fact that in this particular log, they had to declare how many rooms and how many people dwelt at 2 Berwick Street, Leggett, South Shields. I noticed the number 2 for rooms, and I also noticed 7 people dwelling here. This made me imagine a very tight squeezed living quarter. It must have been rough. This would also indicate that Thomas and Isabella were just about to move into 162 Palmerston Street, as there would have been hardly any space for a family of that size to live in comfort with 2 rooms. In the report it states, do not count as a room, scullery, landing, lobby, closet, bathroom. Still though, it must have been a hard time for my great-grandparents on Wade's side during this time period. They were roughing it, hammer, bless. 7 people dwelling at the Burrell household in the middle of Leggett in 1910-1911. James Burrell's children listed here were the uncles and aunt of my granddad, Thomas James Burrell Wade. As pointed out in part 1, the picture becomes clearer as I unravel this from page to page. If I look at the names of the Burrell family, I can see clearly who the Wades were named after in my particular Wade family. I notice the father is named James Burrell. This was the name of my grandfather's younger brother, James Burrell Wade. To add more evidence, James Burrell's wife, who passed before him, as he is widowed, was named Elizabeth Burrell. Again, my grandfather's older sister was named Elizabeth Burrell Wade. So, she was named after her grandmother Burrell or her aunt Elizabeth Burrell. James Burrell Wade was named after his grandfather Burrell. Separately, my grandfather, Thomas James Burrell Wade, took up born 1913, was named after his father, Thomas Smith Wade. Although Isabella made sure to add that middle name Burrell in all of her Wade offspring. This indicates family closeness, clearly. Isabella Burrell Wade died young, aged 35, of a gastric ulcer, so all of her grandchildren, including my father, Alan Wade, would have never ever met their real grandmother Wade, as Isabella died in 1919, which would have occurred only 8 years after this report was logged in 1910-1911. This made me feel quite sad for my Wade ancestors, reflecting upon the realizations I was learning here, but very educating. I found reports referring to the Burrells as early as 1902. One address which was mentioned was 65 Garwood Street. In the article, it was claimed that an Elizabeth Burrell, aged 35, the mother at that time, was having drink problems, leading to James Burrell, the father, taking custody of his children. Pages 70. Map of Leggett from 1900 showing most streets where the Wades lived. Upon this old map of South Shields taken in 1905, over 100 years ago of the Leggett area, I can now see clearly where my Wade ancestors dwelled from roughly 1880 towards the 1950s. The area in which I have highlighted red are the actual streets where my Wade ancestors lived during their lives. Over on the far left side, I first noticed West Holborn. This name pops up much according to my research, as you will see in later pages. In the centre, upper section, I noticed Brunswick Street. This is where John Wade, Thomas Smith Wade's father, lived during 1883 and before. If I look above this, I next notice George Street. This is where John Wade's twin brother lived, George Wade. He was listed as a plumber in 1910, living on George Street, seemingly the next street up from his brother. If I look right from Brunswick Street, I notice some Golden Wade evidence. Princess Street running one way and Orange Street running the other. And if I look at the bottom of Orange Street, I notice Bedford Street, and running directly through centre, I notice Raglan Street. This is where my Wade ancestors dwelled after John Wade and Jane Ann Bullock married in 1883. On the previous reports, Princess and Orange Street were listed as Westall, but it looks like Legate to me, clearly. Now, to help visualise this correctly, Brunswick Street still stands here in 2016. The street is located across the road from the Adam and Eve pub, which runs into Frederick Street. Bedford Street still stands also, but it is named Bedford Avenue today. As I look at this old map, I notice the railway track running through it on the right side of the image. This is Chichester Metro Station running towards South Shields, the track. Naturally, when I look at this map and compare it to a Google map in 2016, I notice a similarity. I can see clearly where the Wades dwelled to the pinpointing accuracy, as I am from South Shields and know these areas quite well. I notice Coleman Street. This is where Jane Ann Bullock Wade moved to from Bedford Street between 1901 and 1911. So, when she moved house, the Wade residence, she moved 8 or 9 blocks down towards the River Tyne, from one end of Legate to the other. Now, if I look towards the right side of Corbridge Street, I notice Reed Street and Campbell Street. This is where John George Wade, great-grandfather's eldest brother, moved to when he moved out of his mother's home. Just left of Campbell Street, I notice Palmerston Street, connecting to it. This is where my great-grandfather Thomas Smith Wade dwelled from 1908 to the 1960s. Looking closer, Palmerston Street ran adjacent to Frederick Street, which still stands, 2 blocks away. On the top right side, I notice Victoria Road and notice the word stables, possibly where my great-grandfather kept his horse, as it looks like a 5-minute walk from his home. I also notice Berwick Street just off of Campbell Street. This is where Isabella Burrell's parents lived, and my grandfather had a home on Berwick Street just before he died in 1955. To help stimulate this history lesson correctly, going back before the early 1900s, the Wades were still in Legate as early as the 1840s. William Wade, 1783, old Geordie Wade's father, was dwelling on West Holborn. John Wade's grandfather, pages 71. 73 St Cuthbert Avenue, South Shields, Thomas Smith Wade's father in 1939. John Wade, 1861 to 1943, date of birth, the 5th of the 2nd, 1861. Upon the map where I see the blue pin, this is the exact location of where John Wade dwelled during 1939. According to the report, John Wade was still alive and kicking. His date of birth, according to the register, was the 5th of the 2nd, 1861, born in Devonport, as suspected. In 1939, John's age would have been 78, shedding more light onto my great-grandfather times 2. His household was listed under the surname Mullen, Mullen household. Listed at the actual address were the following people: Elizabeth Mullen, 23rd of the 3rd, 1885, Margaret C. Bovill Mullen, 26th of the 2nd, 1920. John Wade's occupation, as suspected, was listed as a sea-going fireman, retired. My intuition tells me this Wade was a proper hard grafter hammer. Elizabeth Mullen was listed as an unpaid domestic, and Margaret Bovill Mullen listed as a wine shop assistant. Very interesting from my perspective looking back at my related Wade genetics. So now I know Thomas Smith Wade, my great-grandfather's actual father, lived at 73 St Cuthbert Avenue, South Shields in 1939, which looks like it is located at Horsley Hill. Both John and Elizabeth are listed as widowed, and Margaret Bovill Mullen listed as single. I know by evidence John's wife, Jane Ann Bullock Wade, died in 1932, which was my great-grandfather's mother. John Wade had obviously moved on, as this report was 7 years after Jane had died. I still cannot determine whether or not John Wade was divorced from Jane Ann Bullock Wade, although I know she did apply for separation by 1902. Jane Ann Bullock Wade's last known household was 41 Corbridge Street, as stated on previous page, and John Wade was not registered on the report dwelling at that address. Whether herself and John were together or not is unclear, but at least I have discovered John Wade moving on with his life according to this report in 1939. Interesting to note, John Wade was the grandfather of my grandfather, Thomas James Burrell Wade. In 1939, my grandfather, whom was 26 at that time, his younger brother, James, was 22, Nancy was 29, and John Elliott, Wade in brackets, was 17. As stated on previous pages, these were the actual ages of my direct relatives, and this was the actual location of their grandfather during 1939, John Wade. Another fascinating angle is the fact that my uncle Derek Wade was 3 years old and my uncle Kenneth Wade Bull was 1 year old, my father's older brothers. I can assume my grandfather Thomas James Burrell Wade actually took his children to see his grandfather at John's home at the Hill between 1939 and 1943, possibly just before John Wade died, my grandfather's grandfather. It is fascinating to think that I have found the address of my great-grandfather's father in 1939, and it is even more fascinating to imagine my great-grandfather Thomas, his son Thomas, my granddad and his kids actually going to see John Wade at the Hill, South Shields, in this time matrix back in time. Leggett towards the Hill in South Shields is maybe no less than a 20-minute walk. Maybe my antique Wade relatives travelled by other transport to visit their father or grandfather Wade. I am actually viewing my grandfather and his brothers and sisters' actual grandfather from a mental position in one's mind. Old John Wade, the retired hardy seagoing fireman hammer. During 1939, Thomas Smith Wade was aged 53. His older brother, John George Wade, was aged 57, and John Wade's other family members younger. Visions like these also made me visualise my grandfather seeing his uncle John George Wade at his granddad's home at the Hill, as my actual grandfather was the nephew of John George Wade and the rest of my great-grandfather's brothers and sisters Wade family during this time frame. Page 72. Thomas Smith Wade's father and his uncle William. After searching through many maritime logs and marinas information for Wades and South Shields, I landed upon a piece of sheer gold accidentally. Listing within the Merchant Navy crew lists for the 2nd of July 1891 until the 21st of September 1891, I find an extremely important document declaring more startling information regarding John Wade as being in the Merchant Navy. Not only this, but listed aboard the same ship and dated exactly the same, I noticed John Wade's older brother, William Wade, working alongside him on the same vessel, both old Geordie Wade and Catherine Wade's kids. Now, in previous reporting, William Wade was listed as being born in 1852. I can safely assume this was a coherency issue, as the birth matrix is only out by 1 year in the above report. In this rare snippet, I noticed William Wade is listed as the carpenter, and he also is listed as birthplace South Shields. George Wade, old Geordie Wade, was both William Wade and John Wade's father, listed as a Merchant Navy carpenter himself, as you will notice all the way throughout my Wade book. In this rare snippet above, I noticed John Wade is listed as the donkey man, and his older brother, William Wade, is listed as the carpenter aboard the vessel, which is named clearly as the Rio Tinto. I know from Spanish wording that the word tinto is associated with winemaking in English. Whether or not this was the case, as the name of the vessel is unclear. Looking closer at both reports, it states clearly they were kept aboard the same ship as brothers from the 2nd of July until the 21st of September 1891. Roughly calculating this, it means both William and John Wade were together for over 2 months, sailing the seas aboard a Merchant Navy vessel. Over 120 years ago, John and William Wade were working together on a merchant steamship, sailing together and working together, my direct Wade descendants. As most of the evidence suggested, John Wade was mainly listed as a ship's fireman, but in this particular report he is listed as the donkey man, in brackets, which is the same thing. It would suggest that my Wade relatives this far back in time would jump from trade to trade aboard the Navy vessels. Carpentry, ship's fireman, donkey man, trimmer, shipwright seem to be the common skill sets of my antique Wade family aboard the ships. The report also gives me a view of previous vessels both John and William Wade worked on. The previous vessel William Wade worked on from Rio Tinto was named Lucent. The registration port was listed as Sunderland, vessel type, steamboat. Master's last name, Salmon. Master's address, Sydney Street. The owner's last name was listed as Tully. John Wade's last vessel was listed as being named Olympia, and all of the information tallies up the same as in William Wade's report, suggesting they both worked for the same employer, being moved from ship to ship. To get this related Wade antique visual straight, it means during 1891, John Wade was aged 30. His older brother, William, was aged 40 to 41. He was 10 years older than his younger brother. William was the eldest son of old Geordie Wade, 1823, and John Wade was the joint second youngest of old Geordie Wade, as his twin brother was George Wade, 1861. This also means the majority of old Geordie Wade's kids were following suit, carpentry and donkey men in the Merchant Navy. Pages 73, Thomas Smith Wade's mother, Jane Ann Bullock Wade report. After searching more piously for any reference to the mother of my great-grandfather, Jane Ann Bullock, I stumbled across this report. I first noticed the birth and baptism of my great-grandfather's mother. She was christened in Newcastle, named Jane Ann Bullock, 23rd of July, 1865. The location in Newcastle is undisclosed, but what is questionable is the fact, why was she christened in Newcastle? Because as far as the evidence showed, her family were dwelling in South Shields. As I looked closely at the location of my heritage, I noticed John Bullock was listed as a joiner, listed as Durham and South Shields. Dina A. Bullock's birth location looked like Northumberland, and her son, John T. Bullock, was attending school in Newcastle. According to the report on the right side, which I also found accidentally while surfing through my Wade family tree, it shows the family of Jane Ann Bullock. I first noticed John Bullock, the father, aged 27, Dina A. Bullock, the mother, aged 28, John T. Bullock, the son, aged 9, Jane A. Bullock, the daughter, aged 5, Cuthbert J. Bullock, son, aged 3, and Alfred B. Bullock, the son, aged 1. It's very interesting to note that those names listed on the right, at least 3 of them are the same Christian names as my Wade ancestors within John and Jane Wade's offspring. After Jane married John in 1883, she made sure to name some of her offspring as the same names as her family. Firstly, I noticed Dina A. Bullock. Jane obviously named her daughter after her mother, Dina Ann Wade. And looking further, it seems Alfred B. Bullock, her brother, she decided to name her younger son the same, Alfred Bullock Wade. Now, trying to correctly calculate this time matrix this written log was produced leads me to believe the year was between 1870 and 1871. For starters, Jane A. Bullock, my great-grandfather's mother, is aged 5. She was born in 1865, so counting 5 years forward, I landed 1870. This would indicate that her father, John Bullock, whom is aged 27 in 1870, must have been born in 1842-43. Her mother, Dina, 1843-1844. Her brother, John T. Bullock, 1861. Cuthbert, born 1867. And the baby, Alfred Bullock, 1869. Basically, I am looking at my great-grandfather, Thomas Smith Wade's grandparents on his mother's side, and all of his uncles and aunts. So, I now know my great-grandfather, Thomas Smith Wade, had family on his mother's side, the Bullocks. The report leads me to believe they must have came from outside of South Shields and landed here from either Durham or Newcastle near the moment of Jane Ann Bullock's birth, as she was listed as being christened in Newcastle in 1865, and her brother, John T. Bullock, was attending school 5 years later in 1870 in Newcastle. This would indicate they were just arriving in South Shields by 1871, and as suspected, within the above report, I noticed Orange Street in Leggett, South Shields. This means, as already pointed out earlier in the book, that Jane Ann Bullock moved back to the street where she grew up in with her Bullock family in Leggett, South Shields after marrying John Wade in 1883. Remarkable knowledge, I must say. With my Bullock ancestors just arriving in South Shields during the later Victorian era, it made me capture a small mental visual of John Bullock, Jane's father, listed as a joiner reaching South Shields and finding employment. They settled on Orange Street, Leggett. This would point towards John Wade, whom by 1881 was aged 20, listed as dwelling in Leggett also. By that time, Jane would have reached age 16. Page 74, Forgotten Book of the Wades. Thomas Smith Wade's mother, Jane Ann Bullock Wade, 1865 to 1932, in photo. A.G. Taylor photos. The subject photo reads Gran Bullock Wade. The image above is Jane Ann Bullock Wade, born 1865 to 66, whom was the wife of John Wade. As stated earlier in the book, Jane married John during the 14th of May 1883 at St. Stephen's Church, South Shields. Previous to John and Jane marrying, she was registered as living on Orange Street, South Shields, with the Bullock family in 1871. Firstly reported aged 5. Then, as evidence has shown, she dwelled at 32 Radiant Street in 1883. To me, here in 2016, she would have been my great-grandmother Wade times 2. She was the mother of my great-grandfather Thomas Smith Wade and the grandmother of my actual grandfather Thomas James Burrell Wade. In all, I am looking at my own family from a time machine. A seemingly very graceful-looking lady wearing a classic Victorian wear while resting her hands upon a designed chair. Her eyes look very stern, yet very caring. In the background, I notice a window frame in a shadowy right side. In the foreground, on the left side, I notice what appears to be a hanging curtain. In at least one report written upon her marriage certificate under the term condition, she was listed as a spinster. A spinster was either an unmarried older woman or a person with an occupation who spun wool, generally on the cheap. She married John while she was aged 18. This may point towards the spinning wool scenario with an occupation, possibly. Without any dates, I can only speculate where and when this Golden Wade visual treasure was taken. This image is probably one of the rarest and oldest photos of my antique Wade ancestors so far unlocked. Applying speculation, I would guess Jane on this photo looks in her late 40s or 50s. If correct, either way, judging by her clothes alone, it must have been taken between 1900 towards the 1930s. Just look at that face expression on her hammer. It says it all. While I gaze at my great-grandmother Wade ×2 from my time machine here in 2016, her genetics seem to shine down upon my own physical body from that unique historic distance. Looking at her face, I can sense my elders Wade family in the physical distance. That look in her eyes reminded me of my own father's eyes looking at me when I was age 15. I can closely sense in a closer perspective Thomas Smith Wade across her face, his mother Jane. Looking at Grand Bullock Wade's dress gives me a sense of the time frame, the designs she wears. She looks very motherly and caring, but I know one thing, judging by that strict stern face expression, I would not have liked to got on her wrong side. Much respect to my lost Wade family, heritage and Hartlepool for sharing these photos. Much respect to Doug, George Wilson. A remarkable image of my great-grandmother Wade ×2. To reach Jane Ann Bullock in this instance, I would have to step back in time across at least two grandmothers. Dorothy Scrimger Wade, my Nana Dot, Isabella Burrell Wade ×1, my great-grandfather's wife, and Jane Ann Bullock Wade, my great-grandfather's mother. So she was my great-grandmother ×2.